Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. This video, I'm continuing my analysis into Nietzsche's Will to Power. I'll be referring to section 8.5 in my notes, and this will cover notes 210 through 215 in Nietzsche. So with that, let's begin the lecture. This is Will to Power, and this is section 8.5, covering notes 210 through 215. Okay. Basically what we're going to discuss in this is what I'm going to sort of classify as a doctrine of service for those served, right? So it's going to be a doctrine of service. And I actually had a student that wrote a paper for me. It was a very good paper, and the student talked about sort of the idea of restaurant culture. So in just like a quick 2-second tidy, basically what ends up happening, what the student argued, was that restaurant culture is different from sort of our socio-political culture. The consumption of alcohol to excessive levels within sort of regular culture is frowned upon. In restaurant culture, it's not frowned upon. And the reason why it's not frowned upon is because the level of service, the level of stress that's required to service all of the different personalities of people that you serve day in and day out, it's not unlikely for a waiter or a waitress after their shift ends to sit at the bar and spend a good amount of their tips basically getting hammered. So that was the gist of the paper. Now, with respect to this idea of service, right? With this respect to sort of the stresses involved in the act of serving, it's important to sort of recognize on a very generic level, and that's why I started on a very generic level, sort of the obvious, right? That's an obvious claim. What we're going to do now in a second is to look at Nietzsche's application of this idea of service for those served, and obviously a lot deeper, a lot more methodical. But I just wanted to set the stage of sort of the analysis here. All right, so this is a doctrine of service for those served. The first thing to recognize in the text is Nietzsche claims the following, right? Quote, "The New Testament is a book of seduction," right? He says in note 210, the New Testament is a book of seduction. So, right? It's a book of seduction. And the question is, well, what's the relationship between seduction and service, right? What is Nietzsche attempting to describe here? The next thing that he says, in number 2, is the process of public seduction, right? So now we recognize we're not just talking about the seduction of one individual to another in any sort of courting relationship. We're talking about the seduction of the public, right? And there is a level in which this will sort of map. The discourse on public seduction will map onto this sort of service-based seduction, but I don't want to jump ahead yet. So the process of public seduction begins with, quote, capturing public opinion. Okay. So the New Testament is a book of seduction, and the next thing is seduction requires one to capture right? And this is important. Seduction requires one to capture public opinion, right? It's through public opinion, right? And this is almost invariably why during the political season here in the U.S. or probably anywhere in the world, you'll see all these polls, right? Poll after poll after poll after poll after poll. Our group polls a certain percentage of the population and tries to make generalizations based on that poll. Another group polls another group of the population. Why? Because those in power really do want to know what public opinion is, right? The larger your N, not to get technical, but the larger your sample set, the larger the number of people you have, the clearer an idea you have on what public opinion is, right? So in this idea of courtship, in this idea of seduction, on a sociocultural level, it's important to recognize that seduction begins with assessing public opinion. Similarly, in sort of an obvious way, you would recognize if I was courting or attempting to seduce a young woman, I would find out what her tastes were, I would find out what movies she likes, what clothes she likes, what her interests are. As soon as I figure out what those things are, it'll be easier for me to seduce her because I will be able to show her, represent to her that I have the same opinion, I have the same interests, I have the same likes and tastes as you have, right? So, part one, the New Testament is a book of seduction. Seduction requires one to capture public opinion. You can immediately see that this is a hypothetical syllogism. Therefore, the New Testament is basically a book for capturing public opinion, right? We got deep immediately, right? So if you do the syllogism, the New Testament is a book of seduction. Seduction requires us to capture public opinion. Therefore, the New Testament is a book that requires us to capture public opinion. It teaches us how to capture public opinion, the opinion of the masses. Okay, number three, the narrative is framed within the discourse of service, right? So this narrative of seduction, right, when we talk about seduction, right, it's going to require that we capture public opinion, but that narrative is always, according to Nietzsche, maybe not always, but primarily going to be framed in terms of service, right? So the narrative of seduction will be framed in terms of service, right? This discourse on service. Now, it's not that the idea of service is a bad thing. No one's saying that, right? At least I'm not saying that. The idea of service isn't a bad thing. JFK gives his famous speech on service, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for it, right? This notion of contribution, this notion of service, this idea of service appeals, right? It appeals to the broader populace. Why? Because it makes the broader population of any country, of any group, feel that their service is needed for the state. So for those who actually want to participate, for those, obviously this doesn't account for those who have no interest, but for those who actually want to participate, for those who actually want to feel as though their efforts are recognized and maybe even needed by the state, well, yes, the idea of service is the best means of garnering public opinion, right? We will serve you, you can serve us, we're going to have this discourse on service. Obviously, Nietzsche doesn't situate this within the public realm, he situates it within the religious realm, but I just want to give this sort of public discourse and this political discourse before I get deep into exactly what he's getting at, which is the discourse of service with respect to the Judeo-Christian conception of service. So we'll get there in a second. Here's the quote in number 3 on bullet point 3 on page 34. Quote, a kind of inner detachment, right? This idea of service is a kind of inner detachment that outwardly leaves everything as it was, right? An inner detachment that leaves basically everything as it was. Servitude, slavery, to know how to turn everything into a means of serving God in virtue, right? It's a method, right? When we're talking about service, we recognize then that at least for Nietzsche, we have at least 3, he's not explicit in this, right? This is more me sort of identifying these rather vague points within the text, but you can at least talk about 3 main facets of service, right? So you can have service, right? Service as interpersonal service, right? So service as interpersonal, right? Service as interpersonal, and obviously you can transpose